Hey everybody, what's up? It's Booksy. Today is Monday, July 18th. This is going to be an overview of AMC stock. A little bit of what if and what could happen this week going into the rest of the week. Obviously, just a Monday. And it was a pretty explosive Monday, up 7.6%. Before we jump into it, just want to say thank you for everybody who's reached out about, finances being tight, and whether you're offering me prayers or Venmo, or you're looking to see if you can help me find some work. I do really appreciate it. I'm going to be posting more of my artwork stuff on Twitter, and I might drop a link to my animation stuff here as well. I haven't talked about it for like the first 8 months doing all this, because I felt like it was right to keep them separate, but this is something that, when you're in a tight situation financially, you need to lean into your network. If you're doing freelance work, and this is kind of one of the biggest networks I have. So I'm not, asking for free stuff here. I just really wanted to see if there's anybody out there who needed some work done for animation stuff. And I'm more than happy to work for it. But anyways, thank you so much if you have helped. That's all I needed to say about that, because we got a lot to talk about. So today, 7.6% up. It was a pretty explosive morning, and then afterwards it sort of chilled out. I've already deleted the Gantt chart. I know you're thinking, like, why would you do that, Booksy? Well, the truth is the Gantt chart was really, really helpful, and I felt like it looked really good. But right around here, there was really only two ways to sort of illustrate it, and really this morning or this second up thrust today were the main two ways that I would look at it. And I think you can still sort of find possibility, but you can see here we kind of passed that window. So this is the pocket region. That's sort of my target region, which is between 1787 and 1809. I'm not going to get into those particulars right now, but basically I think that's like the center of liquidity for this zone. The more this has kind of gone on, the more this obviously looks a lot like a rising wedge or a horn structure. I'm not super concerned about that right now. What we saw today appears to be a bit of an SOS, a sign of strength. It broke the region. It broke the resistance here, which was at 614, closed very strong at 654. It doesn't mean it could not dump. And obviously we left a gap this morning down here around, I believe it was 1530. It says 1534. It might be more like 1537. So don't quote me on that. The point here is that I went back and I reassessed the chart because I felt like the Gantt had served its purpose. It gave me a price target. It gave us momentum curves. It gave us the S curve in the beginning. And now looking at it, it's like, okay, what's next, right? Are we going to get the pop all the way up to the mid-18s? I think the answer is yes. There's really only one of two options here. And I mean, it's literally an up or down situation. But you can sort of see the dilemma, right? At this point, with some strength, you could see us coming down to fill that gap and basically coming back to center liquidity here. Because right at this point, we're like in a limbo, right? We're between ranges. And normally in these kinds of setups, they don't tend to spend a whole lot of time in this middle. It's kind of like a squishy middle. But I wouldn't be surprised if this week we do spend quite a bit of time coasting here and going sideways just to sort of fill out the range more. I'm not saying that that's the most likely thing. You can see that in previous times that like in this region, they did not do that, right? They just kind of left it alone and they were like, whatever, And so I don't know. I mean, it's certainly possible we coast sideways till we hit this trend again and push up. I think right now, though, the way that things are going, And the way that I guess the only way I could draw this that makes sense to me, yes, it's easy enough to just shift things over. But I tried to do some other combination TA here to get an estimation of like when we should hit. And really, the best one is tomorrow. I know that with curves, it's super easy to just take a curve, stretch it out, reshape it, however you want to reshape it. But to catch all of these touch points, it definitely seems to me like tomorrow would be the ideal day just to get the last up thrust here into this pocket, this target region. That being said, we rejected the bottom of the range. So we would have to break that. And the bottom of the range was like 1698 or something. And we rejected it. I mean, that was what we hit today at our high. We pulled back, we found some support, and then we got a decent amount of volume influx at the end of the day. But most of the day was just this back and forth craziness. And I say that knowing like full well that AMC has had way more dramatic days. Obviously, looking back on it, you can see, it seems buying was much stronger, than the selling. Selling looks consistent, but it's definitely not outweighing the buying in this case. And that's what you want for an SOS. And in my opinion, it looks stronger. But it's also one of these things where, it was such a silly, every time we got into a new range today, you just saw a flush up and then a flush down and then a flush up and then a flush down and then a flush up, flush down. And it ended up looking a lot like what we experienced basically right here. So I honestly think that what we're probably going to see, what seems most likely to me, is something akin to this motion right here on a final sort of move up. Look at the volume end of day, right? I don't know. These kinds of things, they tend to be cliffhangers. You don't really know for sure. And then all of a sudden they flip flop or whatever. And you're like, well, I don't understand what just happened. To me though, this is a lot like what we experienced on Friday, right? It's just really compressed. And then it looks a lot like this region over here. And I'm not going to, speculate too much more. Obviously, you could also say, well, Booksy, it looks like this region right here. And I remember, they definitely looked very similar. So could you experience something like this where you get this push up that fails to breach and then comes back down? Yes. And that's what I was saying. You could go sideways. But the most important thing here is you can see like this is a supply zone that turned into a demand zone. This is a supply zone right here that turned into a demand zone. This is a supply zone that now acted as a demand zone. So as long as that continues to happen, you're going to continue to see an uptrend. And I do think that this ultimately would be the most logical target. Now, we're going to do something a little different today. I'm going to show you some charts that I did not make. I don't want to go too much more into this right here. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. There's a uptrend, right, that I'm mapping here, and there's a specific reason why I'm using these lines, and I'll get to that in a minute. It has to do with another chart. And then there's this quote-unquote beak formation, okay? And we're going to come back to that in a minute. But first, we're going to talk about some other charts. So first of all, these are charts that I did not make, and therefore you should A, respect who did make them, and then B, understand that we're kind of combining some different ideas here. So this chart that you see right here was made by Patrick in the Discord, who goes by KidPid321. And Patrick's really good at doing the bridge and the sequencing for the normal AMC accumulation and stuff. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about this particular chart right here. This is like the one that, I don't say it put me on the map, but it's kind of the chart that, to me anyways, is the most important chart on AMC because it has everything. It has 100%, has everything that you would ever see on AMC all in one chart. The problem, of course, being that you can't zoom in on every region sometimes. And it's sort of obvious looking at it, especially this bottom. I mean, it's a 1-to-1, this bottom right here with this. I mean, it's literally 1-to-1 bottom. I don't think you could see it any more clearly than that. Now, what comes before is oddly very bizarre looking, right? But I really think that it's pretty clear, you know, this is your first move, this is your second move. And we've discovered that this actually looks a lot like the move to 34 in different time frames. And I can't remember the video that was in, but this was something that I had brought up recently, well, in another AMC video. And I said that it looks very flat right here, but it actually is the same as the move to 34. So this all checks out, right? And coming down into the bottom, the rest of this is basically 1-to-1. So the question then is, what's going on specifically in this region, right? And that's what we want to know, is what's going on right here. And it's a bit challenging, I'm not going to lie. We've had some back and forth discussions about it. This seemed to suggest also that we were going to hit mid-18 or like low 18s. But at this point, you're looking at this and it's kind of like, well, is that it? Like, is that the end of it? And I would say that some of it kind of depends on what happens this week. I think if we look at this later, I mean, this is probably a little closer to being the same size right here. Maybe like that. It's very challenging. All right. So one thing that's very difficult here is this region on the upside here where it says DU up thrust. This Mark 7 is actually the same as the beginning of Mark 9. Both of these are coming out of a bridge sequence. So what's a little difficult to understand here is how can these, you know, how do you pair these up, right? And I find it to be easier to like just imagine that line right here. Okay, it's a rising head and shoulder pattern. You see that? So if you have that mark right there and you have that rising head and shoulder pattern in view, I should be able to mark it up. I never use this, but right here. See that? And the same thing is actually present right there. It looks a little different, but there's actually that bump right there. There's different ways of looking at this, but I think is the correct one. So my thought is this, that probably, all right, probably this is the first shoulder right here. All in one motion, right? And I think it's pretty evident based on this first move that that's a possibility. However, you can see in this case that this is a pretty clear trend line that it kept. Yeah. And so the shoulder would have to be, if you draw this again, right? The shoulder would have to then be, or excuse me, the head would have to be then higher than the shoulder. Does that make sense? Okay. So the rest of this sequence, I'm going to leave for another day because I'm not entirely sure that this is correct. I think this is too low. I believe that it's probably a little steeper, and I'm looking at these specific places, but I'm not going to get into that right now. All I'm trying to do is determine whether or not this is definitely the end of it or not. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, it's a proper head and shoulder, so you're going to have the head go higher than the shoulder. When it's on an angle, you want to draw it at an angle because then the second shoulder right here, right, makes sense. Otherwise, if you go straight across, right, the second shoulder looks like it breaches, right, and that doesn't look right. But this actually makes sense. Okay, so that's where I'm coming back to this other particular. I'm going to push this over to the side region here, and I'm looking at, okay, where is the head and shoulder? So if this is shoulder number 1, and I believe that it is right here, then this would have to be the head. And what I did is very simple. I looked at these touch points right here, 1, 2, and 3. And I took these 3 touch points and I drew a line. First, you might be thinking, why not use these 2? Because, if it's going to create a proper line, then maybe it would be like these. It could be, right? But even still, it doesn't matter. If anything, all that does is it makes it lower. See, and both of them kind of work. Do you see that? So this actually works really well to show like, oh, maybe it is that, I guess what I'm saying is it doesn't matter. Either way, this is not a head for a head and shoulder pattern because this is not higher. And I do believe in the sequencing that we see in that main fractal. So what I did is I essentially just drew this line and then I copied and pasted it and looked to see if this could also be considered the hook line. Now, for those who are not familiar with this, what the hook line is basically if you look at the previous region, okay, you can draw a line essentially from the last bottom that you see through where it hooks, which is the breakdown on the spring specifically. And what it does is it points to the next top. Now you'll note here that it's not exactly, at least as far as I can tell, it's not exactly parallel to this line, but it's pretty darn close. Okay, pretty darn close. So that's really important because then I looked at it and I said, well, does it work? And I think that the more widespread line doesn't work as well. So I just copied and pasted it. And why that happened. And actually, it creates kind of a nice channel. And I would bet that if somebody used a pitchfork on this, they'd probably find it to be quite compelling. And that we're pretty much in the inner part of the pitchfork now. I haven't done that, but I'm not. That's not my best tool. But you can see that this works really well. And if you draw a hook here or if you draw a hook from this base, both of them work really well. So I'm finding that this is pretty darn convincing, that the top should be up here somewhere. Now, that being said, I've got multiple lines and I'm not really sure which one to choose. But I did believe in a lot of the other price targets that I got, so I chose this mid one instead of like a higher one. All right. I think it's reasonable to say it could go all the way up to here on the up thrust. But then after that point, what happens next? And a lot of people, have asked me this question. Should this thing push up tomorrow and it breaches like mid 18s or 18, 10? I think you could see like a final push up, that goes a little bit higher in the range for sure. And I don't think it's unreasonable to go back and just look at previous support and resistance lines. Like here was one, that was pretty much respected a couple times. There's another one right here, just slightly higher, so on and so forth. You might even think, well, could it possibly go all the way to the top of that range, all the way up to almost 19? And the answer is, yeah, I think so. I think $19 could end up being the resistance, but it has to, of course, break certain levels first, okay? What happens afterwards is the bigger question. I think a lot of folks are really expecting this to just kind of push up and run. I'm basing a lot of this on what happened today. The reason I've not talked about post 18 is because I'm not really sure. And when you're not really sure, it's not exactly a good idea to go saying to everybody, this is what I think is going to happen, blah, blah, blah. Because the idea of like, oh, we would just run up and keep going sounds great. But we didn't do that here. We had quite pretty much like a week or so of just consolidation before a push up. And even in this case, when we ran up, we didn't run up nonstop. And we're not even close to this kind of volume yet. It's kind of spreading it out. So my thought is that August 4th, right, is earnings. And this is not something where he said, Adam Aaron, that is, said that, oh, specifically on this date, I'm going to talk about like the plans of quote unquote pouncing, right? He didn't say that. He just said Q2, or like after Q2. So basically after these earnings, you could expect at some point, right, to start getting that information. So I'm not going to look at it as, oh, he's going to reveal it on this date. More like this is just an earnings date. And when you're coming into an earnings date, typically you're either going to run up into it or dump into it. It's pretty rare that we see AMC run up into it and then continue to run up. I mean, that just rarely doesn't happen. I'm not going to talk about GME. I know that GME is going to go through what it's going to go through this week, and it's going to affect AMC. Same with SPY, right? And SPY might actually be even more critical right now because SPY is in a weird spot where basically it has to fill a gap, right? But you can see it's kind of coming to the side of its down channel here. And I suspect that if it doesn't break out, it's going to go down to that 350 finally, right? If it does break out, we might see something pretty explosive to the upside, like a market-wide squeeze. And that would definitely affect AMC going to like 52 or something. But in the short term, look, there's just a lot of room here to goof off, basically. There's a lot of space right here, right? And even if you look at where this terminates, not oddly, right around August 2nd. So right around the same exact time that AMC may or may not be running. So I could see SPY, to be very frank with you, just kind of going sideways and not quite breaking out, doing this business basically for some time. Now, that being said, this bottom definitely looks like a cat ear bottom, and that's pretty interesting because I did call for this to bounce out of this arc and go sideways and form a cat ear, but I was thinking that it would be more of like an arc, right, that would come down. And thus far, it hasn't really quite done that yet. It's been pretty much high in the range that I was expecting. So maybe we get that finally here, right? We get that final push down, and then it's just a big spring. So those are things that could affect AMC timing-wise. Oops, wrong chart. I'm going to look at a couple other things, though, and we're going to talk about what might occur if we get this push up this week. And that's going to be the end of the video. So a couple other charts. So this chart is from Marcus in the Discord, who's been around for a while. I always appreciate his insight. He's also like a really good study on this stuff. He did a really nice, and not surprisingly, he did a really nice rising wedge, and it does appear that it kind of runs all the way up to that 18 target we're looking at. So it's sort of another confirmation in my mind of like speed lines that suggest that. Obviously, if I'm correct and we get a push up, right, and all that really has to happen to break the wedge is just push up to this line. But that push up would basically negate that rising wedge, but it would not necessarily negate it coming back down, right, and finishing off around it. So it's a good chart to keep sort of in your back pocket and look at. And I definitely agree that there is a probable wedge formation there. There's usually more than one thing that you can look at. The next chart, this comes from, well, I want to do this one, but it's not wanting me to zoom in. So this chart right here is called a point and figure chart. If you've never seen something like this before, it probably looks pretty weird. Clearly Thinking is kind of a protege for Father. He's looking like he's going to become a Wyckoff master. And basically what a point and figure chart does is it allows you to see a chart in terms of up and downside, but specifically what's cool about this is it gives you really precise breakout targets and really precise measurements for how far a move can go. And the longer you go sideways, then the higher the move can go. This did correctly predict, if you did the count over here, just like you see these crossbars, this did correctly predict the top region as being like between 32 and 36, and it was like 34 something. So this top region has quite a bit of space here, right? Between 23 and 38. Remember, 23 and 38, if you don't remember, is the region that I marked off for liquidity purposes, like here, basically, because we were lacking liquidity. So it's set up like perfectly to go ahead and tackle the liquidity that's missing, right? To get up into this range. In this particular case, 1654 is where we landed today. You can see that there's a downtrend right here. And this downtrend, you might be looking at it like, I don't get that. Why does that, like, why is that a thing? Well, these are very mathematical, and I don't really know how else to explain it except that they're definitely accurate. You can see here that when it bumped up to this one, this is where we had our sideways. This was about 50% of the move, right? This is when we had our sideways action right here. Okay? So looking at this, what does that mean for the current price action? Well, look, we're approaching. This doesn't say anything about the possibility of going sideways tomorrow or the next day. It's always possible that this could go sideways and bar out a couple times and then push up, right? What it does suggest is that this 1750 to 18 region, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, is where we're going to find that resistance. And it doesn't mean it's going to look like this necessarily, but it is probable that we see some kind of a pullback here before pushing up to the final range. So it's another confirmation of our move right now. And I think that all that being said, it does make me wonder, like it makes me wonder about the possibility of coming up here and just straight up coming all the way back by August 4th to fill the gaps. And I don't know for a fact, like, oh, that's gonna happen or whatever. I have this, I guess it's more of a gut feeling. So it's definitely not financial advice. It's just more of a gut feeling that if they're going to bring it low, like this gap would be the opportunity to do it. You might be thinking, could this be a breakaway gap? Yeah, that's possible, but that's pretty rare. And AMC really likes to fill its gaps. So unless this like dumped and filled tomorrow and then ran up, I'm pretty sure that it's going to fill in the near future. If you were watching carefully and you saw the other schematic that I had brought up, you might be thinking to yourself that perhaps it gets filled down the road, right? We just experienced this breakaway right here. Maybe it gets filled right after the head is formed, right? And that's also possible. So if that were the case, what that would look like is basically you'd have this up thrust here. You'd have a little shoulder. You would come down, it'd probably be a little lower. You'd come down, you'd fill this, right? You'd have another run up that makes you think, oh, it's gonna possibly run up again, and then it would do like some sideways business before finally crashing. And when I say crash, I don't necessarily mean that it's going to come all the way down here, okay? This is different because at this point, you're looking at it more in terms of a regular accumulation schematic, less in terms of a just big run up. So all of this right here, essentially what it is it's a gigantic cup and handle pattern. It's just that the final spring dipped lower right here. So if you look at it that way, it makes a little bit more sense, okay? So looking at it that way, you can see that where it came low was actually the high from back here. So this was like the low region, that was hit. And that was it. Like that would have been the lowest region. So imagine, for instance, that being on the 4th, and then you see this kind of push up like, oh, there's good news, right? Here's another 1, 2, 3 spot, just like over here. It doesn't necessarily pan out, all the way up as high as this one goes, comes back down. You trade sideways for a bit, and then either you go ahead and break out and run, or you kind of come down first for a spring and then run. And I just think that this makes a lot of sense to me. And I know that would delay a lot of things, but imagine them trading this between region. And I just think it makes almost too much sense. So at this point in time, this is kind of what I'm leaning towards. And a lot of people are saying it's just going to run straight up and squeeze. And I think that's almost more reason to be cautious. And then what does this do also is it gives credibility to the idea that SPY could have some room here to sort of figure out what it's going to do, right? And it gives them time to just go sideways. I'm not going to draw it out. I don't know what would happen exactly, but it gives them time to go sideways. And all that choppy action, AMC is also doing some choppy business. And it's finishing the sequencing right before the move. And this is a really massive, massive move. If you remember, I also have been talking about recently this being the volcano and then the mountain. And the mountain, it usually looks like this. It looks like a 1, 2, 3. It has a head and shoulder pattern, and then it does it again, a much smaller head and shoulder, and then it decides whether it's going to have a high spring or in some cases a low spring after you get to here. And this would be like a 4 top, so this would actually look really flat, right? And it either does like a high spring and runs, or it goes low for the spring. Make sense? Okay. So my thoughts for this week are that I don't think they're going to leave the gap alone. I don't think they're going to leave the gap and just run straight up. I think that more than likely what we're going to see is that downtrend that we saw in that point and figure isn't just going to like stop the stock. I think it's probable, and this is me being semi-conservative, right? I think it's probable that you see something like this, okay? And ultimately, what this does is it creates a new downtrend that then has to be broken out of, and then we finally could come back and retest it. And we'll get to that later, I don't know. When we get to this point, we can talk about possible spring options. So my plan is not to assume this is going to just run straight to 20 some odd region. I think it's going to go sideways for a bit. And I think it makes more sense to me that it would do that. In the event that this does break and go pretty hard, remember this occurred right after a pretty huge move. And when I talked about how this is also a little volcano that pushes out, that's where I got that silly chart from, the comparison chart right here, because I was looking at this region versus this whole region. And yeah, like in that case, it just ran up and it hit, remember like the point and figure, it hit that 50% marker. It did the sideways action. It did the head and shoulder action right here. It just made a smaller mountain that was within. So what that would look like is essentially like a little, like a micro version of this. So it will be really obvious, I think. Meaning like you'll come up, right? You'll have the head and shoulder. It'll break down, but it'll happen really, really fast. So like this is really wide. And that's what kind of makes me wonder if if it will happen fast. I think it's really wide. So it would have to look pretty much the same as this, but smaller. So then you get the same exact thing basically, where you get the push up, right? Little head and shoulder. And then it quickly goes up and forms that. And so it would look more or less like this. And so this section would be much smaller. This section would happen up higher and just run. Some of that's going to depend on momentum, right? I don't know. I don't know if they want to delay it just because, but it does seem to me that this would be a really effective way to fake a lot of people out, right? And this is more of like a bullish example of just a normal run up And I've made them all very wide, but I'm really looking at that August 4th. And sure, like you might be saying, well, could this all happen before August 4th, right? Something like that. And the answer is yeah. Yeah, I could. And after that, maybe this doesn't happen this way. It just kind of goes here and then goes up. Either way, I think it's probable this head and shoulder does form here, and that you end up, it takes us back down to this region. All right. And that's pretty much it. I think the whole week would play out much like that if I'm right. And if I'm right, then probably you'll see this thing drop. More than likely drop into Friday. I think it's pretty likely. So that's what we see. And it wouldn't surprise me, to see that, especially given that I think right now Max Payne's at like $14.50, but it'll rise this week. So it might end up being like $15 or something. And it'd be a good time for them to like go ahead and dump it. Get back down there. All right. There's really no other scenario right now that makes a whole lot of sense to me. I know that people would rather it just kind of run straight up. Look, if that happens, great. I've got shares for that. Sometimes you miss out on calls or whatever. But for me, like this makes a lot more sense. Maybe not as long after the 4th. Maybe it's very quick. But this takes a while. But I did mention that September, and we talked about this in other charts. I think this one was the one. Oh, and by the way, this is really cool, but this S-curve actually predicted this top right here, which is really neat. I mean, I think it's cool. We talked about September being very likely. So at this point in time, I don't think, I don't know. We'll see. I'm going to look at some other stuff too and see if I can determine if this is a proper date. But I think on the whole, seems more likely to me that we peak here and then kind of come down before earnings and then see our turn and our run up. And I believe we had determined it was like September something, right? Yeah, so out in September. And that actually gives us a lot of time to sort of push out, get up in this range, and then possibly run. I guess it doesn't give us a lot of time. It gives us about a month, I'd say. So we will see. I'm happy to be wrong here and to not see this thing come back down. But for now, what I see is like a spread out version of a lot of the stuff that happened here. And I just don't know if it's going to be as quick as everyone thinks it's going to be. So I'm going to stick with this for now. If something changes this week, I will definitely update. But this is what I'm seeing for right now. So anyways, thanks guys. I hope you have a good one. I'm not going to talk about any other indicators or anything. You guys can check out RSI and stuff on your own. But have a good one, and I will talk to you later.